There's a high cost to fashion in the clothes we buy and wear. However, it has nothing to do with the numbers on a price tag, but more shockingly, the high costs on human lives and livelihoods. Behind the shiny display windows, perfectly styled mannequins, alluring sales, low prices, name brands, and new trends every season, there is a hidden world of fashion factories that don't follow labor laws and force people to work in unsafe conditions with little or no pay. There are environmental impacts from chemicals and dyes that pollute the water sources in countries around the world and affect the health of people in those communities. Children are sent to work because their families need money, but the low wages they make are nothing compared to the cost on their own safety and lives. We have been conditioned to be consumers, buying things at low cost and buying in abundance. In today's video, we're going to talk about the hidden side of fashion, specifically ethical fashion, what it is, what you should know, how fast fashion is linked to human trafficking, and everything in between. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new around here or don't know who I am, my name is Madison. I'm an Instagram creator, pastime blogger, and current high school fashion design teacher. And here on YouTube, I film sewing videos and tutorials along with other tidbits of videos to share my love and passion for fashion with you all. You can check out more about me on Instagram at Miss Madison Lynn, and honestly, you can find me on all of the other social platforms. But welcome to my channel. I am so excited that you are tuning in for today's video. It is a super important video about a super important topic, and one that I am honestly very passionate about and have learned a lot about over this past year. And I really just feel like in the year 2020, this is a topic that needs to be covered and discussed and talked about, because it's a topic that really has affected a lot of people's lives in this year and just really the fashion industry as a whole. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the topic of ethical fashion. It's probably something that you have heard before, maybe you have seen online, maybe you're slightly familiar with it, or maybe you are like, I have no clue what this means. Please explain it to me. So if you listen to my intro and watch that, I gave a brief introduction about the fashion industry and its impact on the environment and people's lives, and we're really going to break that down and try to understand it a lot more today. Now, when I talk about this idea of ethical fashion, I'm not saying that we should just go out and cancel all these brands, stop shopping, and go marching through the streets with signs demanding things, because at the end of the day, granted, some drastic actions can be great and can bring about change, but I think in this instance, it really starts with us as consumers first being educated about the fashion industry, how clothes are produced, and understand where our clothes are coming from, who's making them, and become conscientious consumers. That first starts with understanding what ethical fashion is, but even before that, understanding the fashion industry, which is something that not everybody takes the time to actually sit down and learn about. So this topic of ethical fashion and sustainable fashion within the realm of the fashion industry is something that I started to learn a lot more about in college, and something that I have been learning more about as a teacher, because I actually teach a whole unit about ethical fashion in my Fashion 1 class, and then I teach a little bit about it in all my other classes. But anyways, this past year I really have learned a lot about it, and I think that's because there have been so many news stories about the fashion industry. 2020 and COVID has changed the fashion industry in so many ways, has changed the livelihoods and the jobs of garment workers all around the world, the business of fashion designers, and so crazy things have happened, great changes have happened. And so I think this is a topic that is really important in today's day and age, and especially in 2020, and I think the future is going to look a lot different in the fashion industry. So like I said, I've been learning a lot about this over the past year, a lot more than I had in the past, and I actually continue to do more research for this video. So we actually have 6 pages of notes that we are going to be referencing and probably half the time reading from, to make sure that we're getting all the important information. So let's switch into our alter ego, which is teacher, and let's get started. So I really feel like these videos that I make about a certain topic is just like me within the classroom geeking out over fashion things, because literally that is me within the classroom. A handful of my students think it's really cool, and then some of them are probably like, she really loves fashion way too much. But anyways, we're gonna dive into this and see what you can learn today about ethical fashion that you might not have known in the past. And I was really joking about the alter ego. We're gonna take these off because they're really distracting in the video. Okay, so let's talk about this issue. Why is it actually important to understand today? Why do we need to even know about how our clothes are made and who's making them if we're just buying them and wearing them? So here's the deal. Fashion in the US is a huge industry, bringing in $365 billion within 2019. On a worldwide level, global retail sales of apparel and footwear reached 1.9 trillion US dollars in 2019. And we're expected to raise above 3 trillion US dollars in 2030. That's a lot. If we were to talk about a $1 trillion industry that's producing clothes and fashion around the world, that means it all starts with people. And that's where we often lose sight of this topic and this issue. There's more than just the cost on a tag at a store. There is a cost to the livelihoods of people working in the factories and their lives. And I think that's where, if we take a step back and we start to see the fashion industry as people, every single piece of clothing is touched by human hands. Humans are instrumental in this entire huge industry. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that when we just look at clothes as trends and the great deal that we get on an item and the brands on the label. Okay, so today we're going to talk about ethical fashion and sustainable fashion. We're going to talk about the business of fashion and the fashion industry and production, and we're also going to talk about this issue of human rights and laws within the industry. So first, let's start by defining and understanding what ethical fashion is, and then what this new kind of word of sustainable fashion is. So ethical fashion focuses on human rights. That's really at its core what it is. Ethical fashion is about the rights of humans, human rights, and those are super important things in our world today, and they should be important within the fashion industry. So they focus on human rights, worker protection, fair practices, and factory safety. Ethical fashion is people focused. It challenges people to think about what they buy and wear and who is making their clothes. So there's a quote by the Victoria and Albert Museum. They were talking about ethical fashion and kind of explaining a little bit more. And they said that ethical fashion is an umbrella term used to describe ethical fashion design, production, retail, and purchasing. It covers a range of issues such as working conditions, exploitation, fair trade, sustainable production, and the environment and animal welfare. So as you can see, ethical fashion covers a host of a lot of things. I'm going to talk about later how human trafficking in many ways can be tied to the fashion industry. That's something that I'm focusing on throughout the entire month of December, if you've been following along with my journey. So if we talk about this idea of ethical fashion, then that means in many ways there also exists an unethical fashion business and industry in our world today as well, which means that unethical fashion is the opposite of ethical fashion. It's centered in people, brands, and corporations that own factories or employ workers in factories but don't take responsibility for how they are treated or paid, and doesn't put people and safety first. They're just worried about the bottom line, the money, and the profit, and growing their brand or business, and not really caring about the people who are making the clothes that make them the money. So for many people, ethical fashion might seem like this phase or a trend. Sometimes that's what it really seems like. We have, bloggers and influencers who are like, I'm an ethical blogger, a sustainable blogger, all this stuff. And I think sometimes we don't really take them seriously because it just seems like a trendy thing to say. But I think people trying to take that step to become more conscientious of what they're purchasing and what they're wearing is an important thing. So when we understand it a lot more, it helps us to just grasp the bigger scope of this issue. It kind of just seems like a cool thing to say, but at the end of the day, ethical fashion is bigger than just a popular viewpoint. It's about understanding the who and the why behind our clothes and challenging us as consumers of fashion, because we are consumers of fashion. We go out and buy clothes, we wear clothes every single day, so we should understand where it's coming from. Just like food, in a way, we should understand where it's coming from if we're putting it into our body, which that's a whole other topic that I am nowhere near qualified to discuss. So when you look into ethical fashion at its core, it's about so much more than trends. It's about so much more than just fashion, and that's what I really want to kind of help us understand today in this video. So when we talk about human trafficking and the fact that it exists within two entities, it exists within sex trafficking and it exists within labor trafficking. The labor trafficking in many ways can be traced to the fashion industry, which I'm going to talk about more in today's video, a little bit more in depth when we talk about the production of clothing and also human rights. So when we talk about this issue, why ethical fashion has been something that I've been really learning more about over this past year. I've also, this past month, really started to learn how ethical fashion is in many ways tied to one of my favorite things, which is fashion and the fashion industry. And the more I've learned about it, the more I've realized, as great as fashion is, there are a lot of things that are messed up and broken about this industry. So in many ways, people view the term ethical fashion as kind of this open-ended phrase. In a way, it's left up to everyone to kind of define for themselves and how it fits into their life and their view of fashion and their values. But ethical fashion truly is about the people who make our clothes and what it costs beyond the price tag, what it costs them and their livelihoods, even though it costs us next to nothing because we get a good deal on fashion with the world of today and the fast fashion industry. So if we're talking about this idea of ethical fashion, there also exists within this whole idea sustainable fashion. Now, ethical fashion and sustainable fashion in many ways exist on their own and their own separate entities. But in many ways, if someone is going to try to be a sustainable designer or a sustainable brand, they in many ways automatically become an ethical designer and brand. Now, it's not always the case, but most people, if they're trying to be sustainable in the clothes that they're making, the fabrics that they're using, their production methods, they're probably going to be ethical in some way, shape, or form. Now, many ethical brands doesn't mean that they're always sustainable in the fibers and fabrics and apparel textiles that they're using. It doesn't mean that they're always sustainable, but they could be an ethical brand. But in many ways, when they work hand in hand and they coincide, it really changes so many things about fashion production in the industry. And so many people, and I feel like so many new up and coming designers and brands are trying to move forward with that today because they recognize and realize how important it is in our world and in people and the environment. So sustainable fashion, by definition, is really focused on the environmental impacts linked to the production of clothes and also the harmful effects of chemicals on farmers and garment workers. So just like ethical fashion, sustainable fashion in many ways can seem like a buzzword to many people and left up to interpretation depending on what you've heard. I would always see people on social media talking about, you know, sustainable fashion, all this stuff. And until I really started to do more research, I didn't really understand it. And I just thought, oh, it's just like a trendy thing to say. But I think it's really important to just be conscious of it. And if you can integrate that into your style, great. If not, at least being educated about it is super important. So when we talk about this idea of sustainable fashion and kind of basically how the fashion industry impacts the environment in regards to just how clothes are produced and chemicals and water and all these different things, here are two interesting facts. Did you know that it takes over 700 gallons of water to just make one t-shirt and over 2,000 gallons of water to make one pair of jeans? That's a little ridiculous when we're thinking about like water and the world today. I'm no scientific expert understanding like how much water exists on the earth and things like that, but the fact that we're using all this water to make one t-shirt and one pair of jeans, and that water in itself is probably being polluted with chemicals and dyes and then just being sent out into other water sources, is a little terrifying and also just not all that positive to think about. And so when the fashion industry starts to change their perspective of sustainable fashion, how clothes are produced, that's when things start to change. And this is why it's important to kind of be educated about this. So at the end of the day, I do not consider myself to be someone who really freaks out about media's portrayal of the environment and all of this stuff like some people might. I definitely have a different view of all of that. But I do recognize and understand that the way the fashion industry has been running for many years and is running right now is not sustainable and is not necessarily good for our environment and the people who are working within the industry. I do know that the fashion industry is producing harmful waste and chemicals that have an effect on not just the specific environments of the places that they're producing those clothes, but in many ways the people who are working within those industries and producing the clothes. Notably, the effect they often have on people's lives, as many chemicals can be traced to cancer, other health issues, and birth defects, which is just crazy. And when you think about these kind of concentrated areas where a lot of people start to get sick, and then scientists start to do studies and research, and they realize, oh, well, all these people were exposed to this chemical like 5 or 10 years ago, and we're tracing this cancer and these birth defects to this. We never realized at the onslaught that these things are going to be harmful in the future or harmful on our lives right now, but they really are. And so many chemicals are used within the fashion industry, and it's really harming the people who are working in it. So honestly, when we're talking about ethical fashion and sustainable fashion, I could literally talk about it forever and ever and ever. This video is probably already going to be too long. I could film multiple videos on it, but there are also so many other great resources out there. So really today, I just want to kind of broaden your view and your horizon and your scope of how you see the fashion industry to really get you to be challenged to think about things that you maybe have never thought about before. So the thing about the conversation surrounding ethical fashion and sustainable fashion is that many brands aren't transparent about how their clothes are produced, where they're produced at, how their workers are treated, how much their workers are being paid. And that's when we get into like a sticky situation where brands are asked, okay, tell us about the production process of your clothes, and then they're just hush about it. So that makes us wonder, okay, what is it that you're not saying, and why don't you want to share that and say that? So in order to truly understand the scope of ethical and sustainable fashion, these two kind of crazy terms, maybe they seem like buzzwords or just a trend, but they really are important to understand. It's also worth understanding the scope of clothing production, which essentially often is kind of this unknown side and unknown story to fashion. If you're not someone who sews clothes or makes your own clothes, you're probably not going to understand the workings of how clothes are produced. And even if you do make your own clothes, you might still not even understand really the business side of fashion, how clothes are produced. And so I think to understand and appreciate why ethical and sustainable fashion is being talked about so much and is an important thing to educate ourselves on, it first starts with understanding the production of our clothes. And like I said, I literally could talk about this forever and ever and ever, but one of the most amazing resources I can point you to is a documentary called True Cost. I watched it for the first time in college, and it really just opened my eyes to fashion, and literally I have not viewed it the same since. And I teach a unit in fashion every single year all about ethical fashion, and my students watch the documentary, so I have watched it a lot of times by now, and it's just an incredible movie that really shows you the entire scope of the fashion industry, from production to farmers to people who are working in the industry, to the effects of chemicals, to just production, the fast fashion industry, people's view of fashion, consumerism. It just is an incredible, very detailed documentary that really is very educational. So that is something I would definitely point you towards. But let's talk about the production of clothing. So before I became a really serious sewer, I never really considered or thought twice about the low prices I was paying for clothes that I was buying. As a high schooler who was like saving birthday and Christmas money and my allowance to like go out and go shopping, I always thought that I was just being super savvy and getting a great deal when I went to Forever 21 and was able to get like a dress and a top for $20. As a high schooler, you know, as a teen, that seemed great to me. And then the more I got into sewing and making my own clothes, I started to realize the very in-depth process of making clothes. A lot of times I would try to replicate something that I saw at the store, and I would end up spending $20 or more on supplies, and that didn't even account for all of the hours I would spend in the labor of actually making that garment. And so the more I started to make clothes and realize everything that went into it, from all the supplies to the hours you spend making it, I started to realize that spending $20 on something, while that might seem like a deal for me, if I were making clothes for someone, $20 would not be enough to cover the amount of time and effort and skill it took to go into making this. And so the more I started to understand the production of clothes, the more I was able to realize there is an issue within the fashion industry if we're selling all these clothes for super cheap, and we're just buying them all the time. And I know that these clothes are really worth more than this when you think about the hours of labor that go into making them. So in the production of clothes and the fashion industry, fashion itself is a billion-dollar industry. It makes tons of money every year, and that's just really in the United States. If we look at it in a worldwide level, it really is like a trillion-dollar industry. If you look at it, some of the top brands and corporations that own all of these major brands, they are priced and worth at like $3 to $5 billion as a whole just for that brand. And I didn't realize until recently the difference between million and billion and how large $1 billion really is. So if you didn't know, here's a fun fact, is that when you think about a million and billion, you know, we think of billionaire, millionaire, people who have a lot of money, right? Well, $1 million equals 0.05% of billion. 0.5% of billion. $1 million equals 0.5% of billion, which means if we have someone who's a billionaire and they give away $1 million to someone, they're hardly even going to know it's missing because it's 0.05%. So when we think about this idea that fashion, it really is this billion-dollar industry, it is making lots of money every single year. all over the world. It's a huge part of our economy, but there are also a lot of downsides to it. So when we talk about the fashion industry, it means everything in the fashion realm, which encompasses everything from textile and apparel brands to wholesalers, importers, and retailers. And the fashion industry itself employs over 1.8 million people just in the United States alone. The fashion industry creates jobs and employs people, but that doesn't mean it is always the best type of employment and working conditions. So as consumers of fashion, we should understand the business of fashion. In the United States especially, for myself, understanding it really helps me to understand the scope of the industry, because the United States exports a lot of its production to other countries. We export most of our production to other countries because it's cheaper labor, and if there's cheaper labor, it means that we can produce our clothes for cheaper, which means we can sell them for cheaper, which means our consumers, Americans, will buy those clothes for cheaper because they want a good deal, and if they can buy it for cheaper, it means they save money, which means they're going to buy more of it. So it's this never-ending cycle, and this is what has really created this fast fashion industry, and in many ways it's like over consumerism, just buying things without thinking about who's actually making them. So the fast fashion industry really has created a demand for cheap clothes and a society that buys clothes without thinking about where they're coming from and who is making them, and really the cost of it beyond the price tag. So while the United States isn't necessarily a major manufacturer in fashion, if you look at fashion history, the United States became a huge manufacturer in fashion in the 1940s, mainly because during World War II, all of the ateliers and fashion houses in Europe had to close because of the war. They weren't able to, be up and running because literally all the cities were being bombed. So at that point, America kind of stepped into the forefront in the fashion realm. That's when we started to see all of our American designers come out, American brands, and America really started, the United States started to become a huge producer of clothes. If you look at vintage clothes from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, all of the tags are going to say made in the United States, and many of them are going to say made in California or New York, because those were our huge manufacturers. Now today, we export most of our clothes overseas for production because it is cheaper, and that feeds into our fast fashion industry of people wanting to pay cheaper prices for clothes. So while the United States isn't necessarily a major manufacturer in fashion, it is one of the main apparel consumption markets in the world, which means while we might not be manufacturing all the clothes, we are consuming most of the clothes, which is a little mind-boggling to think about and consider. So big brands in the US export production overseas because it's cheaper and there are more skilled labor in many ways. Many brands are not really made in the United States anymore, and so that is just something else to consider within the fashion industry. But just because something is made in another country doesn't mean that it can't be made ethically and in a fair way. We also import a lot of clothes from other countries as well. So if you look at the imports and exports and all of like the shipping aspect of fashion, there's a lot going on if you dive into research of that. So from a zoomed out perspective, we see this fashion industry and we think that it's great because the fashion industry is a booming economic business. It creates money, it brings in money, it creates jobs. But when you zoom into it, you start to see like all of the cracks and all of the issues that you can't see from an outside consumerism perspective. And that leads us into all of this conversation about human rights within the fashion industry, and also in many ways kind of like the environmental issues. But I really want to specifically talk about the human rights because I think that at its core is a huge part of the fashion industry, considering that all clothing is touched by human hands, and without humans and people working in textile mills and in textile factories making our fashions, we literally would not have fashion today. So if you didn't know, throughout the month of December, I am taking part in something called Dressember, where I wear a dress every single day to raise awareness for human trafficking, which is this global, worldwide issue. And in many ways, human trafficking today is called modern day slavery. Like I've said before, it exists within two entities, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And in the scope of today's discussion in regards to ethical fashion, we are going to focus on this idea of labor trafficking, because about 75% of human trafficking is labor trafficking, and much of it is actually tied to the fashion industry. So the fashion industry has actually been identified as one of the top 5 contributors of human trafficking in the labor sector. And so when we realize that, and realize the fact that most of our clothes that we buy are being made and produced by people who are being forced to make them, who are working in unsafe conditions, who are being tricked to work in these places, it really should make us consider and think about a lot of things. So this means that many of the items of clothing that we buy from stores were being made by people who were being exploited for their work. This means that they were being paid nothing or next to nothing to make our clothes in an unsafe place. And that is not fair, and that is not right. And we're talking about human rights. This violates in many ways all human rights. And the crazy thing is, when you look at the fashion industry and hear this, you're probably going to ask, well, aren't there laws and rules and regulations to make sure that this doesn't happen? Yes and no. In the United States, there are laws that regulate this. It doesn't mean that labor trafficking doesn't happen, because it still does, even in the United States. But when it comes to working conditions within the United States, we actually do have more laws. We have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which regulates fair pay and wages, the amount of hours someone is allowed to work, the ages that they're allowed to work. But laws like that don't exist around the world, and that is why in so many countries we have people who are paid nothing or next to nothing, who are working in places that are not regulated for safety protocols, because these laws don't exist. And so even though we have American brands exporting production overseas, the American brands are just contracting out those factories to make their clothes. So in a way, they aren't even connected to how those workers are treated, and therefore they don't actually have to take the responsibility on themselves, and they get away with it. And this is something that was really important for us to understand. So the human rights issues in the fashion industry come down to wages and safety of work environments, because garment workers typically earn between 1% to 3% of the retail price of an item, which in itself is really hardly anything, especially if the retail price is like $20 or $15 or $5. And oftentimes they make half than a living wage. So this should really make us start to ask some serious questions, like, are these workers choosing to work in these conditions, or are they being forced to work in these conditions? And are workers earning a living wage? What constitutes a living wage? So according to an organization called Labor Behind the Label, a living wage, which is like a working, sustainable living wage to support yourself, is recognized by the UN as a human right, is a wage that is sufficient to afford a decent standard of living for a worker and their family. It should be earned in a standard work week of no more than 48 hours and must include enough to pay for food, water, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, clothing, and some discretionary earnings, including saving for unexpected events. That's a lot. Think about how much you make and where all your money goes. And think about the fact that in other countries, they are being paid less than a minimum wage or way less than that, and barely have enough money to cover their basic needs. So with this idea and topic and conversation of human rights and wages and safety of work environments, we have had two big things kind of come up in the last couple of years, two key movements that have been created to shine a light on the disparities within the fashion industry in regards to working conditions and wages. One of those is the fashion revolution, and the other one is the Payout Movement. Now, the interesting thing about the Payout Movement is it came about in 2020 thanks to COVID, and COVID significantly affected garment workers and factories and all these brands. And the Payout Movement came about because these brands literally were not paying their workers for the work that they were doing, and the workers said, hey, this isn't fair. We already hardly get paid next to nothing. You're making billions of dollars off of the clothes that we're making. We need to be paid. And so the Payout Movement was created to try and keep brands accountable to this, and to really call them out on this. And if you look at the list of the brands that are part of this, it's literally all the brands that we know. Every single major billion-dollar brand that we all wear and that we all buy. So the Pay Up movement calls on global apparel industries to urgently enact 7 actions, which are to pay up, keep workers safe, to go transparent about their production and wages, to give workers center stage and hear their stories, to sign enforceable contracts, to end starvation wages, and to help pass laws. So on the website, the Pay Up Fashion Movement says, without garment workers, there is no fashion, which is true. Yet the fashion industry abandoned these 70 million workers during COVID. They died on the job from COVID-19 while making face masks. They went hungry as brands refused to pay them for billions of dollars worth of clothing already sewn and shipped. They were imprisoned for standing up for their basic human rights. Garment workers around the globe work tirelessly for us and for the fashion labels that we love without financial or legal security. Most of these workers have no legal security, so even if they come forward and say something, basically they're going to lose their job, and it's just going to be a horrible situation. Fashion brands earn millions of dollars in profit each year, and yet year after year, garment workers keep fighting for survival. It doesn't have to be this way. So I'd really encourage you to go look at the Payout Movement. It is very interesting. It's also interesting to see all the names and brands connected to it who did not pay their workers. The other one is the fashion revolution, and the fashion revolution has been around for a number of years, and it's commonly known by their signs that say "Who made my clothes?" and ask that question. People like hold up a sign and it says "Who made my clothes?" And then they also have pictures of garment workers in factories holding up signs that say "I made your clothes," bringing forth this idea that we need to be able to put a face to the clothes we're wearing. We need to be able to connect our clothes to real human beings, people that are just like us, and bring humanity into the fashion industry and the people who are making our clothes. So the fashion revolution campaigns for a clean, safe, fair, transparent, and accountable fashion industry, and they do this through research, education, collaboration, mobilization, and advocacy. They believe in a global fashion industry that conserves and restores the environment and values people over growth and profit. And the fashion revolution really has been doing some incredibly great things. I love the work that they're doing, and I've definitely learned a lot from them and still have more to learn about. What I would also encourage you to go check them out. They have a ton of incredible resources, and they also have yearly reports where you can literally go and look at brands and see what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, what they're being accountable to, what they're being transparent about. And it's really amazing all of the work that goes into this to bring a light on many of the realms and aspects of the fashion industry that we don't always stop to think about or really educate ourselves about. So like I said, the human rights side of the fashion industry, people who are working in these factories and making our clothes, is really connected to the wages that they're making and the working conditions. And like I said, the fashion industry is one of the 5 key main contributors of human trafficking within the labor sector. And so a lot of times we kind of rack our brains and we don't even could believe the fact that human trafficking is taking place within the fashion industry. People are being trafficked and forced to make our clothes. And the answer is yes. And I've kind of always known this for years, and I've been learning more about it this year. But I actually heard from someone on YouTube who left a comment on my video about Dressember, who was actually sharing about this huge issue in India that I had never heard about before. I was kind of familiar with something similar to it. And so she commented on my video and she said, "As you mentioned, there is an overlap between human trafficking and garment production. In India especially, there is a trafficking scheme. I think it translates to Happy Bride, where young women from poor villages would sign a contract to work for a factory for 5 years, maybe more. And at the end, they will get enough money for a dowry so that they can marry. The thing is, after they arrive, they are basically locked in a factory compound where they sleep in rooms with many others on the floor and usually aren't allowed to leave and work to exhaustion in unsafe conditions." And the thing about human trafficking is that it preys on people's vulnerabilities. We think about the fact that, okay, why are these people going to work in factories if they know that they're barely going to get paid anything and they are not going to get a living wage? At the end of the day, most of our clothes are produced in countries that are not super rich necessarily, and they also don't have a ton of jobs. And so for many of these people, going and working a factory is literally the only job that they can get that makes them any kind of money. And so while in many ways that puts them in a situation of being exploited, being forced to do things, being connected and kind of coerced into human trafficking, many of them sometimes don't have any other option. And this is why we really need to bring about a change and more transparency and more laws to support and fight for and protect the people who are working within the industry. So I actually looked up this whole idea of the Happy Bride scheme, and it's really translated back into its native language, and it's called Sumangali Thatam, and it's kind of, like it said, translated into a marriage scheme called Happy Bride. It's one of the worst practices in the textile industry. In Tamil Nadu, South India, up to 300,000 girls and young women are lured into 3-year apprenticeships in spinning mills in return for a lump sum which can be used for their dowry. That's how they're lured in, but we all know that that isn't actually how the story ends up. And this is just one instance and one case of human trafficking and labor trafficking within the fashion industry that is happening in India. But cases just like this are happening all around the world, and in sometimes worse cases than this, where workers are forced to do certain things to keep their job, to make money. And it's just really horrible that people are treated like this just for making the clothes that we buy without sometimes even thinking about the person who is making it. There's actually an organization called TRAID, T-R-A-I-D, which actually helps girls escape from this kind of trafficking within the labor industry. And it's so incredible the work that they're doing. And I know there are so many other organizations around the world who are specifically working with garment workers to give them a voice. But there are also so many other organizations that are working with people who are stuck in human trafficking. The International Justice Mission works with people who are within labor trafficking and modern day slavery around the world as well. So that's a lot of information, kind of heavy topic to talk about. So what in the world do we do with all of this information? It's kind of a sensory overload of being bombarded with all of these things to think about. So where do we go from here? When you start to really look at the fashion industry and take a deep dive into where our clothes are made, who is making them and how they're produced, it can seem very overwhelming and almost in many ways like a lost cause. Thinking that we have to, like, we're in it all alone. And at the end of the day, we're not. There are a ton of incredible organizations like Fashion Revolution and Payout and so many more that are trying to bring awareness for this issue within the industry. But it also takes us as the consumers of fashion to be aware of how our clothes are produced and who's making them and the disparities within the garment and fashion industry. However, ethical fashion isn't just about canceling brands. That choice is up to you based on your values and the businesses and brands you want to support. If a handful of people go out and cancel brands, that's not going to bring about any change. Change comes when we educate ourselves and we're aware of what's going on in the world and we're aware of the backstory behind our clothes and how they're produced. So it's really about educating ourselves and being knowledgeable about fashion being more than just a trend or low price on a tag, but about the people creating our clothes and also raising awareness for it and educating others. We live in a world that talks all the time about human rights. I am someone who is super passionate about many issues that deal with human rights and the lack of human rights. And so when you look at the news and media today, we're constantly seeing this theme, but then you take a step back and you realize that things like the disparities within the fashion industry, human trafficking and labor trafficking and things aren't always talked about. And if we're really going to talk about human rights and people being treated equally and fairly, we need to start talking about these issues, especially when the fashion industry is a huge billion-dollar industry around our world today. So what can you do? Really, like I've continuously said through this video, educate yourself, become more knowledgeable and understand clothes and where they're coming from. I challenge you to go into your closet and look at the tags on your clothes and see where they're made. You're going to see that many of them are probably made in China or India or Bangladesh, and then look at that brand and go do research on that brand. See if that brand is transparent about how their clothes are produced. Think about how much you paid for that garment. Go and do research and see what countries produce the most clothes. Go and do research and see what countries pay the least amount of minimum wage for garment workers and see where the correlation is. The more research that you do, the more you're going to become educated about this issue. Really, I'm just like scratching the surface today and giving you a jumping off point. Learn about fast fashion. The fast fashion industry is a huge part of our industry today, and it's very intriguing to look at, but there are also so many issues with it. Learn about ethical fashion, learn about sustainable fashion. Sustainable fashion is literally so cool. There's so many cool scientific things about sustainable fashion, and ethical fashion is really about honesty and fairness and about laws and things being right and people being treated right. And also, like I said, go and watch the documentary True Cost. It is seriously an incredible documentary to really open your eyes to the many things that you might not have known about the fashion industry. I will also link some additional resources down below, some incredible books that you can go read and check out. I have a whole stack of books that I am hoping to read within the next month to continuously learn about this topic. There's some great resources out there. There are tons of incredible videos on YouTube that you can go look up as well. But yeah, like I said, I could talk about this forever. So I hope that this has just kind of challenged you to think and consider things that you maybe haven't considered before, and to challenge you to go out and to learn more, to do more research, to learn about the brands that you love and the clothing that you love. And when we talk about this whole idea of ethical and sustainable fashion, that is the conversation for another time of how we as consumers of fashion, people who love fashion and style, can move towards being more ethical and more sustainable. So I will probably film a video about that at another time, so stay tuned for that. But thank you so much for watching today's video and really being open to hearing about an important topic, about being open to the fashion industry, to learning about it, to learning about labor trafficking and how human trafficking is connected in many ways to the fashion industry. So I hope that you will go out, raise awareness for it, continue to learn more about it, and spread the word. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked what you heard or were challenged by it. Share it with your friends and family so that they can continue to learn about it. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought about it, what was interesting, what you would challenge me to go learn more about. Tell me what you have learned about ethical and sustainable fashion. Tell me your stories about it, all that stuff. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.